Hello, I wanted to make a video that shows you how to use counters and the number line to add and subtract integers. And integers can be positive or negative whole numbers, and they can also include zero. Some of these you're very familiar with when it comes to adding and subtracting positive numbers. That's not going to be any different than you're used to. Adding a positive number, I guess first I will start with, what is this number? This is positive 3. That's how we can show it with the counters. On the number line, you would mark positive 3. To add to any number, if you're adding a positive, in this case, we're adding positives. If I wanted to add positive 2, that means to join with 2 other positives, which gives us a total of 5 positives. If we have 3 positives and join them with 2 other positives, you now have 5 positives. So this works the same way. If you add a positive number, in this case we're adding positive 2, that'll give us 5. So we're saying 3 plus positive 2 equals 5. When we're adding positives, that is the same as just adding. It's no different than saying 3 plus 2. Where it gets a little tricky is when we change this number to adding a negative. We want to add a negative to positive 3. How does that change how we do this? So we still start with 3, and now we want to add 2 negatives. So you're still starting with positive 3, and you're going to add negative 2. So I'm going to add 2 negatives. When you have a positive and a negative together, they actually cancel each other out. Like a positive 1 and a negative 1, if you add them together, they create 0. You create something we call a 0 pair. So when we combined a positive 1 and a negative 1, so by adding them together, we're joining 3 positives and 2 negatives. This cancels out. The negative 1, get a little bit more space. The negative cancels out the positive. Minus 1 and plus 1, if you do both together, you get 0. What are you left with? 1 positive. You're left with a positive 1, a 0, and a 0. So in this case, our answer is positive 1. So what actually happened on the number line was we went this way and ended up at positive 1. So 3 plus a negative 2 is actually the same thing as just 3 minus 2. When you add a negative, it's actually the same thing as just subtracting a positive. Your number will be smaller in this case. So let's say we are going to subtract a positive. That shouldn't be any different than we're used to, because we're used to subtracting positives. So 3 minus positive 2, that's just saying you have 3 and you want to take away 2. So with the counters, starting with 3, I want to subtract or take away positive 2. Write it down here. So to take away 2 of these positives, I just cross them out. I took away 2. I had 3. I took away 2 of them. I'm left with positive 1. The same thing that happened when I added a negative 2 is what happens when I subtract a positive 2. They both end up saying just 3 minus 2, which equals 1. The last one is a little bit different. Now we're going to subtract a negative number. We're going to take away a negative number. So we're starting at 3, and we're going to take away negative 2. How could I show that? I'll start with 3, and I want to take away negative 2. How can I take away negative 2 from positive 3 if there aren't any negatives to take away? Well, I could represent 3 in a different way. Let's say I add 0 to it. If I add 0 to 3, it won't change the 3. So I'm going to add 0 to 3. So it still says 3 because it's saying 3 plus 1 minus 1. And then I'm going to add another 0. And you'll see why I'm doing this. Because now, if you notice, I have 2 negatives that I can take away. I have 3 plus 0, which is still 3. And now I want to take away 2 of the negatives. So now I'm going to take away these 2 negatives, which leaves me with 5 positives. Which, if you notice, is the same answer we got when we just added a positive. So somehow subtracting a negative number and adding a positive number both create a larger number. They increase. They move to the right on the number line. So subtracting a negative is the same thing as adding a positive, which brings us 2 to the right. So there's a few ways that you can do this. You can think of it with these counters. You can use your number line. I think when it comes to subtracting a negative, the counters really help you picture where the negatives are. You just add these 0 pairs in order to get something negative to take away. Because without adding the 0 pairs, there's no negative numbers to take away. And the only way you can add a negative without changing the original number is by adding a positive with it, so that you're not adding negative 1 to something and taking it away. You're adding 0 to something and taking away the negative. So taking away a negative ultimately adds a positive. So these two are very similar. Adding is the same thing as subtracting a negative. Adding a negative or subtracting a positive is the same thing as just subtracting the 2 numbers. Hopefully that helps you get a good visual of how to add and subtract integers. This works with any numbers. If you started with a negative number, it would still move up 2. Negative 3 plus positive 2 would still give you 2 higher